In the early decades of the 1800s, when the high plains of the Missouri stretched wild and endless, a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the scars on his hide. Few creatures tested that measure more than the great grizzly bear. They were the kings of the Rockies, cunning, near bulletproof, and meaner than a cornered wolverine. Many a trapper carried the marks of those beasts to his grave. But among those who lived by trap and rifle, one man had a secret, a method that made him, in his own quiet words, 4 times as lucky when it came to the Old Ephraim. His name was James P. Beckwourth, the mixed-blood trapper, scout, and sometime Crow war chief whose name still rides the wind across the Big Horns. Most men of the mountains knew that firing at a grizzly was like signing your own death warrant. A bear could weigh 600–700 pounds, thick-boned and muscle-bound. A .54 caliber Hawken ball, unless it struck heart or spine, only made him angry. Jedediah Smith learned that the hard way on the Cheyenne River in 1823. The beast tore off half his scalp and broke his ribs like matchsticks. Smith survived by some miracle stitched together by his men, but he carried those scars all his life. After that, trappers spoke the name grizzly with a kind of grim respect. Hugh Glass, too, left his story on the earth, mauled half to death, and crawling 200 miles to Fort Kiowa. Their journals and the accounts in Leroy Hafen's The Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West make it clear the grizzly was the most dreaded creature on the continent. Beckwourth was no fool. He'd watched men die from charging bears that refused to quit breathing. He once wrote in his 1856 autobiography, "A grizzly fears no living thing. Not man, not bullet, not God himself, if he stood before him with thunder in his hands." But Beckwourth had a keen eye for behavior. While wintering with the Crow Nation, he learned from his adopted people that grizzlies, for all their power, were slaves to their nose. Their sense of smell was sharper than a wolf's, and their first instinct was to circle downwind before attacking. The crow hunters, armed with bows, would bait a bear's sense, not its sight. And so Beckwourth's secret trick was born. Instead of stalking a grizzly like a deer, Beckwourth set a scent snare, a mixture of buffalo tallow, dried berries, and smoked venison, placed carefully in a hollowed log downwind of his position. He'd drag a rag dipped in the same mixture in a wide half circle, leaving a scent trail that pulled the bear exactly where he wanted it. Then he'd climb a deadfall pine and wait rifle loaded with a double charge of powder and ball, knife loosened in its sheath. The bear would nose its way along that invisible trail, its head raised, sniffing, never expecting danger from above. When the beast paused beneath the log, Beckwourth aimed for the ear, a near vertical shot that pierced the skull directly into the brain cavity. It was brutal, efficient, and astonishingly effective. He claimed, in later retellings around the Yellowstone camps, that it made his hunts 4 times more fruitful and 10 times less foolish. Modern scholars have tested similar accounts in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal and found that the strategy had grounding in biology. Grizzlies' olfactory lobes are enormous. They trust scent over sight or sound. By controlling the wind and luring the bear into a predictable route, Beckwourth reversed the roles. The hunter became the ambusher. In Beckwourth's own words, recorded in 1856, the bear thinks himself the stalker, that is his undoing. This technique spread quietly among seasoned trappers. At the 1832 Pierre's Hole Rendezvous, Charles Larpenteur wrote in his own 40 Years a Fur Trader, "A certain colored man, calling himself Beckwourth, taught several of the boys a trick of owl, scent that made for easier bear-taking. None could deny its cleverness. Even Kit Carson, usually skeptical of Beckwourth's boasts, noted in passing that Beck was a damn sight luckier than most when it came to grizzlies. But make no mistake, Beckwourth's trick wasn't for the faint-hearted. A bear hit wrong, even from above, could still climb or tear down the tree. One winter near the Wind River Range, he nearly met his end. His powder was damp, and the ball only stunned the animal. It clawed the trunk beneath him, shaking loose bark and snow. He wrote later, "I prayed, not to live, but to have one more shot." He got it a second ball straight through the skull. When the beast fell, Beckwourth sat in that tree for an hour, trembling, too weak to climb down. Such was the life of the mountain men. Courage measured by inches, by timing, by the way you set your jaw when death looked you in the eye. Today, at the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, you can still see rifles and traps from Beckwourth's era. One exhibit tells of scent lures used by early trappers, documented again in DeVoto's Across the Wide Missouri. The principal wind, scent, and patience remains a cornerstone of bear hunting lore even into the modern age. Beckwourth's method wasn't about cruelty or conquest, it was about survival, a thinking man's edge in a land that killed the careless. He once said to a young trapper, "A man's mind is sharper than his knife if he keeps it honed." In the story of the American West, we often remember the loudest legends, the brawlers, the braggarts, the men who carved their names into trees. But sometimes the truest measure of genius lies in the quiet study of nature itself. Beckwourth's secret wasn't magic, it was observation. He watched, learned, and lived. And that in a world ruled by claw and fang was the greatest frontier trick of all. The winter of 1832 hit the high country like a hammer made of ice. The first snow came early before the elk had time to move down from the slopes, before the beaver were done sealing their lodges. It came with a bitter north wind that froze a man's beard stiff before breakfast and split rifle stocks by noon. James P. Beckwourth and a small band of trappers had taken up winter quarters along the Green River, not far from where present-day Pinedale stands. They'd built rough cabins of cottonwood and mud, roofs thick with snow and willows. It wasn't much, but in that land, a little warmth meant the difference between another sunrise and a lonely grave under the pines. Among them were Baptiste Dubois, a wiry French-Canadian who could outcuss a crow, and Tom Fitzpatrick, the gray-eyed Irishman who'd later lead caravans across the Oregon Trail. Hard men all, seasoned by frost and fight, but even they whispered that winter might break them. Each dawn, Beckwourth rose before light, wrapped in a blanket robe of buffalo hide, stiff with frost. He checked the traps along the creek, mostly beaver sets under the ice, baited with peeled poplar. The pay for pelts was good that year. Street? Louis traders were paying near $6 a skin, and word from the last Rocky Mountain rendezvous was that silk hats in Europe were driving prices higher still. But in that cold, the beaver weren't moving. The creeks had frozen hard enough to hold a horse, and the traps froze solid beneath the ice. To dig them out meant standing in water up to the knees, ice biting through moccasin and flesh alike. "Damnation itself," Baptiste muttered one morning, "ain't so cruel as this valley." Beckwourth only grinned. "That's why we get paid more than the farmers." He'd survived worse snowblindness in the Wind Rivers, starvation in the Bitter Roots. Yet this storm had a hunger all its own. By the third week, even the firewood was running low. The men began to ration the powder, saving their charges for meat alone. Every shot counted. It was on one of those bitter mornings that Beckwourth saw the tracks fresh, broad, and heavy. A grizzly had come down from the high ridge, nosing along the half-frozen creek. In summer, a man might let the bear be, but in winter, bear meat meant survival. He followed the tracks upwind, careful and slow. The snow was knee-deep, dry as sand. Each breath left a ghost of frost before his face. The prints led to a fallen pine, half buried in drifts. The bear had dug there, likely raiding a cache or looking for roots. Beckwourth knew what to do. He unpacked his pouch and prepared his old scent snare, the same method that had saved him countless times before. Buffalo tallow mixed with crushed juniper berries, he rubbed it on a strip of cloth and dragged it in a slow, winding line toward the shelter of a spruce tree. Then he climbed into its branches, rifle loaded with 2 charges and a prayer. The snow fell heavier now, the world turning to silence. He waited, motionless, heartbeat in his ears. Then came the sound, a low crunch of snow, the slow, rhythmic breath of something massive. The grizzly emerged from the white, fur rimed with frost, snout twitching, its breath steamed in the cold like smoke from hell. It followed the scent trail straight beneath him. Beckwourth steadied his rifle against the limb, thumbed back the hammer, and aimed for the ear just as before. But at that instant, the branch cracked under the weight of snow. The bear looked up. The shot rang like thunder. The ball struck true, driving through bone and brain. The bear fell without a sound, a mountain of fur and blood in the snow. Beckwourth climbed down slow, every sense alive. When he reached the carcass, he touched its massive head and whispered a quiet thanks, as the crow had taught him. To waste words on the dead, he said, was to waste breath. But to forget gratitude was to invite bad luck. That night they feasted on roasted bear meat, rich and heavy. The fat smoked in the firelight and hissed against the iron pot. The men laughed again, voices thawed by the meal and the warmth. "Reckon your trick saved us again, Beck," Fitzpatrick said, raising his tin cup. Beckwourth smiled, eyes glinting in the fire's glow. "Wasn't a trick, Tom, just good manners with nature." For 3 more weeks they held that cabin against the storm. The snow piled higher than the eaves, and the wolves howled through the night. But the bear meat lasted, and the hides dried on racks by the fire. They sewed moccasins from the skin and rendered tallow for lamps. When the thaw finally came in late March, the valley came alive again, meltwater running, geese overhead, elk moving through the timber. The men packed their furs and prepared for the long trail east toward the spring rendezvous near the Popo Agie River. As they left, Beckwourth looked back once at the cabin. Smoke still rose from its chimney. He knew the place would be gone by next. Winter, buried, burned, or found by wolves, but its memory would stay like the scent of wood smoke in a man's coat. Later he would recall that winter in his memoir. "The cold had no mercy, yet it taught us mercy. I learned that to live in the mountains, a man must think like the things that live there, patient, quiet, and always listening to the wind." Historians today note that the Green River country was among the harshest trapping grounds in the entire fur trade era, according to Dale L. Morgan's Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West. Only the hardiest survived a winter there. Beckwourth not only survived, he thrived, turning the very perils of the wilderness into lessons. The Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal still lists 1,832 as a year of heavy losses across the trade routes. Dozens froze or starved that season. Yet among the names recorded at the following summer's rendezvous, Beckwourth's is marked present. He came riding in on a horse, packed, with furs laughing, tanned, and unbroken. Men said he was lucky. Others said he had mountain spirits guarding him. But those who'd spent a winter at Green River knew better. He simply understood the wilderness in a way few ever did. That winter forged him. From that point on, Beckwourth carried not just the lessons of scent and survival, but of patience, the kind a man earns by waiting out a blizzard with death scratching at the door. He'd say in later years, "The mountains test every man's worth, but if you listen close, they'll teach you all you need to know." And for those who knew him, trapper, Crow warrior, or soldier alike, they'd tell you the same. James P. Beckwourth wasn't just a man who lived in the wilderness, he was a man who belonged to it. By midsummer of 1832, the snowmelt from the Tetons had turned the valleys into rivers of green. The cottonwoods shimmered silver in the wind, and the high peaks still carried veins of ice that gleamed under the July sun. It was the season every mountain man waited for rendezvous time. For a man like James P. Beckwourth, that meant more than just trade. It meant life itself returning to the blood. After months of trapping, fighting the cold, and eating little more than dried meat, the mountain men would ride for hundreds of miles to find the one place where the wilderness turned into a roaring carnival of furs, gunfire, and whiskey. This year's gathering was held in Pierre's Hole, a fertile valley at the foot of the Teton Range in what is now Idaho. It was a place made for such things: wide meadows, cool water, and good grazing. The word had spread all spring. The American Fur Company men would be there, along with the free trappers and the Crow, Flathead, and Nez Perce nations. It would be a grand meeting, and as fate would have it, one written in blood and legend. Beckwourth came in from the Green River country, his pack train heavy with beaver plumes and bear hides. He rode a stout piebald horse and carried his trusted Hawken rifle across the saddle, a weapon he'd polished like a priest tends his cross. His companions, Baptiste Dubois and 2 Crow hunters, followed behind, singing low under their breath as the Tetons rose before them like the walls of a giant fortress. As they crested the ridge and looked down into Pierre's Hole, the The sight was something near holy. Hundreds of lodges dotted the meadow. Smoke curled into the blue sky. The air was alive with the sound of laughter, gunshots, fiddles, and trade talk. Traders' wagons circled the camp, and the flags of several fur companies fluttered in the breeze. "By thunder," said Baptiste, "it looks like the gates of paradise, if paradise smells of whiskey and beaver pelts." Beckwourth only smiled. To a mountain man, paradise looked exactly like that. They rode in slow, greeted by old friends and rivals alike. There was Jim Bridger, young and sharp-eyed, telling stories, too wild to be true. Tom Fitzpatrick was there, acting as a captain of sorts, trying to keep the peace among hundreds of trappers half-drunk on success. Even William Sublette, partner in the great fur companies, had come west with a caravan of goods: coffee, lead, powder, tobacco, and enough liquor to float a keelboat. The traders called out their wares like preachers calling the faithful: knives from Street Lewis, blankets, finest Hudson's Bay weave, whiskey 2 pints for 1 prime skin. It was chaos and brotherhood rolled into one. Men who'd nearly frozen together the winter before now drank side by side. Rival companies forgot their grudges for the sake of song and dice. There were horse races, shooting matches, mock duels, and feasts that lasted until dawn. Beckwourth traded well that year, near 600 pelts. He swapped for powder, lead, and a new rifle mold, then shared a jug with Bridger under the open sky. The air was thick with campfire smoke, and the smell of roasted meat. Someone played a fiddle near the wagons, and the tune carried clear across the meadow. "Reckon you've earned another year of life, Beck," Bridger said, passing him the jug. Beckwourth laughed. "I'll take it, long as it don't cost me too dear." But paradise never lasted long in the mountains. The next morning, as the sun climbed over the Tetons, riders came tearing into camp. Crow scouts, faces painted and eyes wild. "Blackfoot!" they shouted in a mix of English and Crow tongue. "Blackfoot war party, north of the valley." Instantly the camp came alive. Men dropped their cups and reached for rifles. Traders shouted for their guards. Women gathered the horses. The Blackfoot old enemies of nearly every tribe in that country had come raiding before, but never during a rendezvous this large. Beckwourth moved like a man already expecting it. He'd spent years among the Crow and knew their ways of war. He ran to the wagon, circle, where Fitzpatrick and Bridger were shouting orders. "How many?" Beckwourth asked. "Maybe 50, maybe 100, Fitzpatrick said. "They're bold, riding close." Beckwourth checked his priming. "Then we'll be bolder." The Blackfoot came just after noon, a wild whooping charge down from the hills. Their ponies kicked up dust like a thunderstorm. Arrows and balls whistled through the air. The mountain men, traders, and allied tribes formed a quick defense, firing from behind wagons and trees. Beckwourth took position with the Crow fighters, his rifle steady, eyes calm. He fired once a clean shot that dropped a charging horseman, then reloaded with the precision of long habit. Around him the noise was hellish: screams, the crack of muskets, the whinny of wounded animals. In later years, Bridger would tell the story that Beckwourth seemed untouchable that day, a man guided by spirits. He fought side by side with the Crow, rallying them in, their own tongue, shouting above the din. "Hold your ground, the bear fears no wind." The battle raged for hours. The Blackfoot fought fiercely, using the terrain to dart in and out of range. But the combined firepower of the trappers and their allies was too much. When the smoke cleared, the meadow was littered with bodies. The surviving Blackfoot fled north into the timber. The cost was high. A dozen men lay dead, more wounded, but the camp still stood, and the trade was saved. That night, the fire burned low. There was no music, no laughter, only the hiss of wet logs and the sound of the wounded breathing. Beckwourth sat apart, cleaning his rifle by the glow of the coals. His hands were steady, though his eyes were far away. He'd seen war before, but this was something else. The wilderness gave life freely, but it demanded payment just as freely. When Fitzpatrick came by, he said softly, "You fought like a madman today, Beck. You saved lives." Beckwourth nodded. "Ain't bravery, Tom. Just a man trying to live through his own legend." When the trading resumed 2 days later, the mood was changed. The whiskey still flowed, but quieter now. Men spoke of friends lost, of the thin line between laughter and the grave. In his later telling, Beckwourth said, "Pierre's Hole was a grand meeting, but it showed that no matter how many men gather, the wilderness owns the last word." Historically, the Battle of Pierre's Hole marked one of the last major clashes between the mountain men and the Blackfoot. It also symbolized the beginning of the end for the great fur trade era. The beaver population was declining, and markets back east were shifting. But in that moment, under those stars, none of them knew the end was coming. They lived like men who believed the mountains would last forever. Modern historians, writing in Leroy Hafen's The Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, note Beckwourth's role at Pierre's Hole as both warrior and intermediary. His knowledge of Crow diplomacy helped prevent a larger war afterward, convincing the Crow not to pursue the fleeing Blackfoot further. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Wyoming even holds documents referencing Beckwourth's account from his autobiography. Though some details were likely embellished, the core remains true. What mattered most wasn't the gunfire or the victory, but what the battle revealed. That these men lived at the edge of extinction and glory, sometimes in the same breath. When dawn broke after the battle, Beckwourth walked to the ridge overlooking the valley. Mist hung low over the meadow, and the Tetons glowed gold in the first light. The place looked peaceful again, as if the earth itself had forgotten the blood spilled the day before. He stood there a long while, rifle in hand, and said to the wind, "The mountains remember what men forget." Then he turned his horse toward the horizon, ready for whatever waited, beyond the next divide. For the mountain men, there was always another river to cross, another trail to blaze. And for James Beckwourth, warrior, trapper, trickster, survivor, the legend was only beginning. By the time the snows fell again after Pierre's Hole, James P. Beckwourth had ridden deeper into the heart of Crow country than any white man alive. He'd fought beside them, traded with them, and now, by their will and his own, he was one of them. They called him Bull's Robe, a name given after he'd slain a Blackfoot raider with a bull's courage and covered his shoulders with the animal's hide. To the Crow, that name meant more than any birthright. It meant belonging. For Beckwourth, it wasn't just another adventure, it was home, of a kind. He'd been born between two worlds, a black father, a white mother, and a frontier that never cared for either. But here, in the high valleys between the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers, he found a people who, after, measured a man not by color or origin, but by deeds. And deeds he had plenty to offer. The Crow were a proud people, tall, fierce, and given to laughter as easily as war. Their camps stretched for miles along the river bottoms, tippies painted with the stories of hunts and battles. Beckwourth learned their tongue fast. He hunted buffalo with them, shared their feasts, and listened to their elders tell of the spirits that guarded the mountains. In his autobiography, The Adventures of James P. Beckwourth 1856, he wrote, "The Crow were my family. I ate of their pot, fought their battles, and slept under their lodges. I ceased to be merely a white man. I was a Crow in heart, if not in blood. Each dawn, the village woke with the cry of the women tending fires and the whinny of horses on the plain. The young men rode out in small bands, feathers and trade beads glinting in the sun. Beckwourth rode with them, rifle across his lap, dressed in tanned elk hide and a crow feather, and headdress given to him by a chief named Long Horse. He became known for his strange weapon, that Hawken rifle of Street Lewis steel, faster than any bow and deadly accurate. The Crow believed it had a spirit of its own, and that Beckwourth could speak to it through the smoke. One night, a young warrior asked, "Does the thunder in your gun come from the mountains, Bull's Robe?" Beckwourth smiled. "No, brother. It comes from a man who listens to what the wind tells him." That winter, word came of a Blackfoot war party raiding Crow hunting grounds along the Yellowstone. The chiefs called a council drums beating, fires throwing shadows across painted faces. The air was thick with smoke and tension. Beckwourth sat beside Longhorse and the younger chief, Iron Shoulder, as they planned their response. He understood both the Crow hunger for revenge and the wisdom in patience. Finally he spoke, "If we strike them in their camp, they will scatter and live to strike us again. But if we wait until they come for our horses, the bear will walk into his own snare." The council murmured agreement. Beckwourth's reputation as a strategist was growing, and his bear trick had become the stuff of legend among the lodges. The crow said he had a spirit guide in the shape of a white bear, so they waited. For 3 nights, they camped silent along the ridges, watching the valleys below. On the 4th night, a band of Blackfoot riders came down to raid the horse herd, just as Beckwourth had predicted. When the moon reached its highest point, he gave the signal. The valley erupted in thunder. Crow warriors charged from both sides, their cries echoing like ghosts through the canyons. Beckwourth fired twice, then drew his knife, joining the melee. When it was done, the snow was red, the horses safe, and the Blackfoot driven back north. In his later telling, Beckwourth said, "The crow said I was touched by the spirit of the bear, and I did not argue. It is better to let a people's faith be your armor than your pride." For his bravery and cunning, the crow honored Beckwourth with the title of Chief of the Dog Clan, one of the highest warrior societies. He led hunts, settled disputes, and took a crow wife, a woman named Pine Leaf, famed for her beauty and fierceness. She'd been captured as a girl from the Gros Ventre and raised by the crow. Many said she was the equal of any man with a bow. Together they became something of a legend, a pair of warriors who fought side by side and rode as one. "She was the truest companion I ever knew," Beckwourth later wrote. "When she laughed, the sun seemed brighter. When she rode, the earth itself seemed to tremble." Pine Leaf would become a story of her own, in Crow lore, a warrior woman whose courage inspired generations. But for now, she and Beckwourth hunted together, feasted together, and dreamed of a world untouched by the creeping shadow of white traders and soldiers who were beginning to push ever farther west. But the mountain man's world was never meant to stay still. By the late 1832, the fur trade had begun to decline. The beaver were scarce, and the demand for pelts in Europe was falling. Traders who once brought fortunes in goods now arrived lean and desperate. Rendezvous grew smaller. Rumors spread of soldiers building forts along the Platte and Missouri forts. That meant law and the end of the free trapper's way of life. Even among the Crow, the wind carried change. Beckwourth noticed the young warriors growing restless, eager for glory in a world that no longer offered it. More and more rifles appeared in the villages, traded from white men who smelled of greed and politics instead of pine and smoke. He saw the first missionaries pass through, speaking of salvation, but carrying the gaze of conquerors. Once, when a trader asked Beckwourth why he stayed among savages, he simply replied, "Because they have not yet learned to lie with their eyes open." One spring morning, Beckwourth woke to the call of geese flying north and knew the time had come to move again. Pine Leaf stood with him on the ridge above the village, watching the sunrise spill over the plains. "You will go," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "The trail calls me, same as it always has." She handed him a small pouch buffalo hair bound with sinew, filled with red earth. "So you will remember where your heart was buried," she said. He took it, eyes lowered. "I'll carry it as long as I live." When he rode out that day, the Crow warriors lined the path, silent except for the beat of a single drum. Beckwourth didn't look back. The wind in the grass carried their farewell. Historians today, notably Bernard DeVoto in Across the Wide Missouri and Win Blevins in Give Your Heart to the Hawks, confirm that Beckwourth lived with the Crow for over a decade. He rose to prominence not through deceit or coercion, but by genuine understanding. His tactics, his diplomacy, and his respect for native ways set him apart from most of his contemporaries. The Museum of the Mountain Man still displays Crow beadwork and weapons from his era, along with accounts from Charles Larpenteur and James Willard Schultz, who later lived among the Blackfeet and confirmed Beckwourth's influence as a bridge between cultures. Years later, when Beckwourth returned to white settlements, he told the story of his Crow years with pride and with the melancholy of a man who knew he'd left something pure behind. Many dismissed his tales as exaggerations, but those who'd known him on the trail swore by their truth. He would say, "Among the Crow, I learned that courage isn't in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that waits." A man's strength lies in how well he can listen to the earth, to his horse, to the silence before a storm. And so, for all his travels from the Rockies to Santa Fe, from trapper to scout, Beckwourth's truest home was never marked on any map. It was in the stories whispered by the wind across the Bighorn Valley, where Bull's Robe once rode beneath the endless sky. The world had changed since Beckwourth first rode west under the flags of the fur companies. The great beaver trade was dead. The mountain men, those rough kings of the untamed Rockies, were vanishing like smoke on the wind. But James P. Beckwourth, ever restless, ever chasing the next horizon, refused to vanish with them. When he left Crow Country in the early 1842s, the frontier no longer felt infinite. The trails were thick with wagons now, settlers pushing west in long lines of dust and determination. Where once the trappers' rendezvous had filled the meadows with laughter, now soldiers and surveyors mapped the land in straight lines and ink. Beckwourth rode south through the Wind River Range, across the Platte, and down into the dry, red lands of New Mexico. There, a new world awaited, one of war, politics, and opportunity, where a man's skill with a rifle and his knowledge of wild country could make him valuable again. In 1846, war came between the United States and Mexico. To most men, it was a faraway struggle over borders drawn on maps they'd never seen. But for Beckwourth, it was a chance to put his frontier wisdom to use once more. He joined as a scout and courier under General Stephen W. Kearny, helping guide troops along the Santa Fe Trail. His knowledge of native languages and western terrain made him indispensable. He rode ahead of the columns, reading the land like a book, the bent grass, the broken branches, the faint smoke on the horizon, each sign a sentence in the wilderness tongue. Colonel Richard Mason later wrote of him in his field notes, "No man knows the ways of this wild country like Beckwourth. He moves through it as if the earth itself whispers to him." During the campaign, he helped secure the path from Bent's Fort to Santa Fe, often scouting hundreds of miles alone, sleeping with one eye open and his rifle across his knees. At 50 miles a day, he could outride most soldiers half his age. After the war, Beckwourth drifted westward again toward California, where gold fever had begun to burn through the land like wildfire. But he wasn't one for panning streams or digging earth. His eyes were always on the horizon, not the ground. He took work as a guide for wagon trains crossing the Sierra Nevada. The route west was brutal, long deserts, high passes, and mountain storms that could swallow men whole. The Donner Party's tragedy in 1846 had shown the cost of ignorance in those mountains. So Beckwourth, drawing from a lifetime of wilderness lore, began mapping a new route through the northern Sierra, a path shorter and safer than the old Truckee Trail. He worked with a band of Shoshone scouts and a handful of mountain men, cutting through dense timber and high snowfields, blazing a road that would later bear his name, the Beckwourth Pass. At nearly 5,200 feet, it was one of the lowest crossings of the Sierra Nevada, and it changed everything. By 1850, emigrant wagons were rolling through it by the hundreds, their wheels creaking over the same ground where Beckwourth had once hunted elk and bear. The man who'd once lived by trapping beaver now opened the West to thousands. At the western mouth of his trail, Beckwourth built a rough settlement, part inn, part trading post, part refuge. He called it Beckwourth's Ranch, near what's now Portola, California. There he fed weary travelers, sold supplies, and told stories that seemed too large to fit the walls of his log house. He was in his late 40s then, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. The same laughter, the same fearless glint in his eye, the mark of a man who'd looked the wilderness in the teeth and never blinked. Old trappers came through sometimes, men like Kit Carson and old Bill Williams, and they'd sit by the fire swapping tales. Beckwourth's were the longest and the loudest, filled with grizzlies, river floods, and hairbreadth escapes. Travelers who met him in those years described him as a grand towering figure, part chief, part soldier, part showman. He'd serve up venison stew and whiskey, then tell how he once tricked a bear by feigning death, or how he'd ridden 5 days through blizzard and starvation with nothing but a rawhide thong to chew. And if you doubted him, he'd grin that wolfish grin and say, "Son, I didn't come west to be believed, I came west to live." In 1854, a writer named Thomas D. Bonner arrived at Beckwourth's ranch. He was fascinated by the man's stories, his life among the Crow, his battles, his trailblazing. Bonner proposed to write it all down. Beckwourth agreed, dictating his life story across several weeks. The result, The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, was published in 1856, one of the most extraordinary autobiographies of the American frontier. It reads like tall tale and truth braided together, and maybe that's just what it was. Historians argue about the exaggerations, but none deny the raw authenticity of the world it depicts. Grizzly dens, buffalo hunts, and the daily knife edge between survival and death. In its pages, Beckwourth captured the soul of a vanishing breed. The mountain man before the steam engine and telegraph buried him for good. By the late 1852, Beckwourth had become a living legend. He'd outlasted the fur trade, the frontier wars, and even the wilderness itself. But fame, like snow on a spring morning, doesn't last long in the West. The railroads came. Towns rose where his campfires once burned. The trails he'd blazed turned into wagon roads, then stage lines. The West no longer belonged to the free spirits, it belonged to progress. Beckwourth drifted again, guiding troops during campaigns against the Cheyenne and Crow, the very people he had once called family. It weighed on him, though he seldom said so aloud. In one letter from 1864, he wrote, "The land I once called home is no longer mine to roam. The mountains still stand, but they do not speak as they did." He was growing old. His black hair had turned to silver, his shoulders bent slightly, but his eyes, those wild, searching eyes, never lost their fire. In 1866, at the age of 68, Beckwourth returned one final time to Crow Country, the land of his youth, the place that had once made him a chief. He came as a U.S. Army scout, but he left as something more, a man making peace with the ghosts of his own legend. He was welcomed by old friends, now gray and wise, who still called him Bull's Robe. They feasted, told stories, and shared pipe smoke under the stars. A few weeks later, he grew sick with what was likely severe hypertension or a cerebral hemorrhage, what they called bursting blood in those days. He died there, among the Crow, in a small lodge beside the Bighorn River. They buried him according to their own rites, with honors fit for a warrior, his rifle laid across his chest, his horse tethered nearby to carry him to the next world. Today, the wind still sweeps through Beckwourth Pass, and the trails he blazed are followed by highways and travelers who scarcely know his name. But in the stories of the old frontier, in the journals, the campfire tales, the smell of pine smoke and gunpowder, his spirit endures. He was a man between worlds, born a slave son, made a chief, a trapper, a soldier, a trailblazer, a man who refused to fit the mold of any age. And somewhere, on a lonely mountain night, when the wind moans through the pines and the coyotes sing, it still sounds a little like Bull's Robe, laughing at the edge of forever. There's a saying among the old hands of the frontier: every trail ends in a story, and every story fades into the wind. When the age of the mountain men died, it didn't die with a bang. It slipped away quiet like the evening light on the Tetons, slow and golden and gone before you know it. But men like James P. Beckwourth left their mark in ways that no railroad or telegraph could erase. He was more than a hunter or scout. He was the living bridge between two worlds, between the wild and the civilized, the native and the settler, the old and the new. And though his body lay beneath the Crow sky, his story kept on walking. Long after Beckwourth's death, trappers still told of his fourfold trick, that cunning use of scent and wind to draw a grizzly to its doom. It became one of those half-whispered tales that made the rounds in the bunkhouses and campfires of the new frontier. Some said the trick was passed on through the American Mountain Men Association, those living historians who keep the old arts alive. Others claimed it resurfaced in the journals of frontier hunters, a generation later, adapted to new rifles and new lands from the Bitterroots to the Yukon. But the truth was simpler. It wasn't just about hunting. It was about thinking like the wilderness itself, understanding that survival didn't come from strength or firepower, but from patience and observation. That was the soul of Beckwourth's trick, He never fought the land, he listened to it. And in that, he represented what the best of the mountain men became, men who learned from the land they conquered until the two were indistinguishable. By the 1,870 seconds, the fur trade was a memory. The Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, once the rowdiest gatherings west of St. Louis, were long gone. The old free trappers, Fitzpatrick, Sublet, Bridger, Glass, all ghosts now. Even the Grizzlies, once kings of every valley and canyon, were being pushed higher, hunted for sport or spectacle. But every so often, a prospector or surveyor would stumble across a weathered carving on a tree, somewhere deep in the timberline. A set of initials, maybe JB, or a rough drawing of a bear's paw. They'd stand there, hat in hand, wondering if it was just coincidence or the last trace of a man who'd once outsmarted the great beasts themselves. The Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal later wrote, in an 1889 retrospective, "Men like Beckwourth are gone, but the instinct that guided them still haunts this wilderness, that edge of caution, that whisper that says, 'The wind is wrong.' They left it behind, not in books, but in the bones of the land. Time has a way of sanding the edges off truth." Beckwourth became a storybook hero in some places, a liar in others, a curiosity everywhere. His autobiography was dismissed by some scholars as boastful, but later rediscovered as one of the most valuable first-hand windows into early Western life. Modern historians in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, the Smithsonian, and the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale have gone back to his words and found more truth than myth. The details line up, the geography fits. The techniques he described, from reading animal tracks to using scent to lure predators, all hold water. He may have embellished his adventures, but the bones of his life are carved deep into the American story. And the secret trick that once seemed like a tall tale now stands as proof of a deeper kind of intelligence, the kind that comes only from living as part of nature, not apart from it. Stand at Beckwourth Pass today, high above the California Valley, and you can still feel him there. The wind runs through the same pines he walked beneath. The clouds slide over the same ridges he once scouted, silent and proud. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a rifle crack, the bellow of a bear, the low hum of a man laughing somewhere beyond the tree line. It's easy to forget, in this world of engines and wires, that the West wasn't always tamed. There was a time when every mile of it had to be earned. And for those who earned it like Beckwourth, it was never about gold or glory. It was about belonging to something bigger than any map could hold. The wilderness shaped him, tested him, and in the end, it claimed him back. What Beckwourth taught the world, though few realized it at the time, was that knowledge was the true frontier weapon. When brute strength failed, when powder ran low, when the wind turned, wrong thinking was what saved you,